The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield as Captain Sarah Mitchell completed her pre-flight inspection of the F-16 Fighting Falcon. Her hands moved with practiced precision, checking every bolt, every connection, every system that would keep her alive in the sky. The aircraft gleamed silver in the early light, its sleek form promising both speed and deadly accuracy. Sarah had been flying combat missions for 8 years, but today felt different. The intelligence briefings had been more intense, the faces of her commanding officers more serious. Enemy forces had been spotted massing near the border, and reconnaissance suggested they were planning something significant. The base was on high alert, with pilots rotating through continuous air patrols to monitor the situation. As she climbed into the cockpit, Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Phoenix 1, this is Control Tower. You're cleared for takeoff. Your patrol sector is Delta 7. Maintain radio contact every 15 minutes. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Hayes, a man she'd known since flight school. His tone carried the weight of responsibility that came with coordinating multiple aircraft in potentially hostile airspace. The F-16's engine roared to life, sending vibrations through Sarah's body that she'd grown to love over the years. This machine was an extension of herself now, responding to her thoughts almost before she moved the controls. She taxied to the runway, performed her final checks, and received clearance for takeoff. Within seconds, she was airborne, climbing rapidly into the clear blue sky. The landscape below shrank away as she gained altitude, transforming the world into a patchwork of fields, roads, and settlements. Her mission was routine surveillance, flying predetermined patterns along the border region while maintaining vigilance for any unusual activity. 2 hours into her patrol, Sarah's radar picked up something unexpected. Multiple aircraft signatures appeared on her screen, moving fast and in formation toward friendly territory. She increased her altitude and adjusted her heading to get a better visual confirmation. Through her canopy, she could see them now. Enemy fighters, at least 6 of them, flying in tight formation and clearly on an attack vector. Her training kicked in immediately. Sarah switched to the emergency frequency and began transmitting. "Control Tower, this is Phoenix 1. I have visual on 6 enemy fighters bearing 270, altitude 12,000 feet, heading directly toward our territory. They appear to be armed and maintaining attack formation." The response came back immediately, tension clear in the controller's voice. "Phoenix 1, maintain visual contact but do not engage. We're scrambling additional aircraft to your position. Estimate time of arrival 15 minutes. Sarah knew that 15 minutes might as well be forever in air combat. The enemy fighters were already crossing into friendly airspace, and their trajectory would take them directly over a populated area where ground forces were stationed. She had 2 choices: maintain her position and watch as enemy aircraft potentially struck targets below, or engage immediately despite being outnumbered 6-1. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. Sarah had sworn an oath to protect her country and its people. She checked her weapons systems, confirmed her missiles were armed and ready, and began maneuvering into an attack position. Her heart rate increased, but her hands remained steady on the controls. This was what she'd trained for her entire career. "Control Tower, Phoenix 1 is moving to engage. I cannot allow enemy aircraft to reach their targets." Sarah's voice was calm and professional, betraying none of the adrenaline now coursing through her system. She knew the risks, understood that she was about to face overwhelming odds, but there was no hesitation in her actions. The lead enemy fighter had spotted her approach and was turning to meet her challenge. Sarah could see the pilot in the cockpit, could imagine the surprise on his face as he realized a single aircraft was moving to intercept their entire formation. She selected her first target, locked onto his aircraft with her radar, and prepared to fire. What happened next would become the stuff of military legend, a story that would be told and retold in pilot training programs for years to come. But in that moment, as Sarah Mitchell dove toward 6 enemy fighters with nothing but skill, determination, and an unshakable belief in her duty to protect others, she was simply doing her job. The radio chatter from the base had fallen silent as everyone waited to see what would unfold in the sky above them. Controllers watched their radar screens with growing tension, tracking the single friendly aircraft as it closed with the enemy formation. Some whispered prayers, others simply held their breath, but all understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sarah's first missile streaked across the sky, its contrail marking a deadly arc toward the lead enemy fighter. The pilot tried to evade, pulling his aircraft into a sharp climbing turn, but the missile's guidance system held true. The explosion lit up the morning sky as the first enemy aircraft disintegrated in a ball of fire and debris. But 5 enemies remained, and they were no longer surprised. The real battle was just beginning. The battle intensifies. The remaining 5 enemy fighters broke formation immediately after watching their leader's aircraft explode in a brilliant fireball. Sarah had expected this reaction and was already maneuvering to avoid their counterattack. Her F-16 responded instantly to her commands, rolling into a steep dive as enemy missiles streaked past her canopy, missing by mere feet. The advantage of surprise was gone now, but Sarah had something her opponents didn't expect: years of combat experience and an intimate knowledge of her aircraft's capabilities. She pulled her fighter into a punishing vertical climb, feeling the G-forces press her deep into her ejection seat. The enemy pilots, caught off guard by her aggressive maneuvering, struggled to match her altitude gain. From her elevated position, Sarah could see the entire battlefield spread out below. The enemy fighters were trying to regroup while simultaneously hunting for her position. She keyed her radio again, knowing that her communications were being monitored by both friendly and enemy forces. Control Tower, Phoenix 1 has engaged. 1 enemy aircraft down, 5 remaining. They're trying to surround my position, but I still have the altitude advantage. Her voice remained remarkably steady despite the life-or-death situation unfolding around her. The response crackled through her headset with urgency. Phoenix 1, reinforcements are still 8 minutes out. Can you maintain engagement until they arrive? 8 minutes. In air combat, that was an eternity. Sarah calculated quickly. She had 4 missiles remaining, plus her 20mm cannon with approximately 500 rounds. Against 5 experienced enemy pilots and modern fighters, those numbers weren't encouraging. But retreat wasn't an option, not with friendly ground forces directly in the path of the enemy formation. 2 enemy aircraft had managed to climb to her altitude and were approaching from different angles, trying to box her in. Sarah recognized the classic pincer maneuver and knew she had seconds to act before they achieved a firing solution. She rolled inverted and dove toward the earth, using gravity to increase her speed beyond what her pursuers could match. The enemy pilots followed her down, but Sarah had already planned her next move. As she approached a layer of scattered clouds at 8,000 feet, she suddenly pulled back on the stick, bringing her aircraft into a brutal climb that would have blacked out a less experienced pilot. The G-forces compressed her vision to a narrow tunnel, but she maintained consciousness through breathing techniques learned in countless training exercises. Her maneuver worked perfectly. The 2 pursuing aircraft, caught off guard by her sudden direction change, overshot her position and found themselves exposed to her weapons systems. Sarah selected the closer target and fired her second missile. The enemy pilot tried desperately to evade, launching flares and chaff to confuse the incoming weapon, but Sarah had fired from optimal range and angle. The missile impacted the enemy fighter's engine section, sending it spinning toward the ground in a trail of black smoke. Sarah didn't have time to confirm the kill. The pilot's wingman had recovered from the evasive maneuver and was now lined up behind her, his own weapon systems locked onto her aircraft. Warning alarms screamed in Sarah's cockpit as enemy missiles launched toward her position. She immediately began defensive maneuvering, throwing her F-16 into a series of sharp turns and altitude changes designed to break the incoming missile's guidance locks. Flares burst from her aircraft like deadly fireworks, creating heat signatures intended to lure the enemy weapons away from her engine exhaust. The first missile fell for the deception and detonated harmlessly among the flares, but the second held its lock. Sarah pushed her aircraft to its limits, diving toward a nearby mountain ridge while simultaneously turning to present the smallest possible target profile to the incoming weapon. At the last possible second, she pulled her fighter behind the ridgeline, using the terrain to break the missile's radar lock. The weapon, unable to reacquire its target, exploded against the mountainside in a shower of rock and flame. Sarah had survived, but barely. From the ground control tower, the battle looked like a deadly dance played out across radar screens. Controllers watched in fascination and horror as the single friendly blip maneuvered among multiple enemy contacts. The distances between them sometimes measured in mere hundreds of feet. Every few seconds, one of the enemy contacts would disappear from the screen, marking another victory for the lone pilot. "She's incredible," whispered one of the junior controllers, forgetting protocol in his amazement. How is she doing this? Lieutenant Commander Hayes didn't take his eyes off the radar display as he responded. Experience, skill, and probably the biggest set of nerves in the entire Air Force. But she can't keep this up forever. Where are those reinforcements? The answer came immediately from another controller. Still 5 minutes out, sir. Phoenix 1 needs to hold on just a little longer. Above the clouds, Sarah was already engaging her third opponent. This pilot was more cautious than his fallen comrades, keeping his distance while trying to maneuver into a favorable firing position. Sarah recognized the tactic. He was trying to wear her down, force her to exhaust her fuel and ammunition, while his remaining wingmen positioned themselves for a coordinated attack. But Sarah had been in similar situations before, and she knew that patience wasn't a luxury she could afford. The longer this fight continued, the more likely it became that enemy reinforcements would arrive or that she would make a fatal mistake due to fatigue. It was time to take risks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. She turned directly toward the cautious enemy pilot, accelerating to maximum speed in what appeared to be a head-on collision course. The enemy pilot, surprised by this seemingly suicidal maneuver, began evasive action just as Sarah had predicted. At the last possible moment, she rolled her aircraft 90 degrees and fired her third missile at point-blank range. The enemy fighter disappeared in an explosion so close that debris rattled against Sarah's canopy. She flew through the expanding fireball, her aircraft shuddering from the shockwave but emerged intact on the other side. 3 down, 2 to go, and reinforcements were finally beginning to appear on her radar display. Against all odds, the 2 remaining enemy fighters had witnessed the destruction of their comrades and realized they were facing a pilot of extraordinary skill. Instead of pressing their numerical advantage, they began to circle at a respectful distance, clearly reassessing their strategy. Sarah could see them through her canopy, 2 sleek aircraft maintaining formation while their pilots undoubtedly discussed their options over secure radio channels. Sarah's fuel gauge showed she was running lower than she would have preferred, and her ammunition count was down to her last missile plus cannon rounds. The sustained high-G maneuvering had taken its toll on both her aircraft and her body. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat, and her muscles ached from the constant strain of controlling her fighter under extreme conditions. But she could also see friendly aircraft approaching on her radar display, still 3 minutes away, but closing fast. If she could just survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive, the odds would shift dramatically in her favor. The challenge was keeping the 2 remaining enemies occupied without giving them an opportunity to coordinate an effective attack. The enemy pilots had apparently reached a decision. They began to separate, moving to positions that would force Sarah to divide her attention between 2 threats simultaneously. It was a sound tactical decision that put her in a nearly impossible situation. She couldn't engage one without exposing herself to the other, and trying to evade both would eventually lead to them achieving firing solutions. Sarah made her choice with the cold calculation that separated elite pilots from the merely competent. She selected the enemy aircraft that posed the greatest immediate threat, the one maneuvering to position itself behind her current flight path. Turning hard toward this target, she accelerated to intercept, knowing that this aggressive move would expose her to attack from the second enemy fighter. Her radar lock achieved tone, indicating her final missile was ready to fire. But before she could launch, warning alarms filled her cockpit. The second enemy pilot had anticipated her move and was already launching missiles at her exposed aircraft. Sarah had perhaps 2 seconds to choose between offensive action and defensive survival. She chose both. Even as she began evasive maneuvers to avoid the incoming missiles, she launched her final air-to-air weapon at the target she had locked. It was an incredibly dangerous decision, trying to evade while simultaneously attacking required split-second timing and perfect coordination. The enemy missiles streaked toward her position as Sarah threw her F-16 into the most aggressive defensive maneuvering of her career. She dove toward the earth while rolling continuously, using every electronic countermeasure at her disposal. Behind her, she could hear the distinctive sound of her own missile's motor igniting as it accelerated toward its target. The first enemy missile lost lock due to her countermeasures and self-destructed safely away from her aircraft. The second held on longer, forcing Sarah to continue her punishing evasive sequence until her vision began to tunnel from the sustained G-forces. At the very edge of consciousness, she heard the missile explode somewhere behind her, close enough to rattle her aircraft with shockwaves, but not close enough to cause serious damage. As she pulled out of her dive and regained situational awareness, Sarah looked around desperately for her targets. One enemy aircraft was spinning toward the ground, trailing smoke and flame. Her final missile had found its mark. But where was the sixth and final opponent? Her question was answered by the harsh sound of cannon fire echoing across the sky. The last enemy pilot had used Sarah's defensive maneuvering to position himself perfectly for a gun's attack, and 30mm rounds were now streaming past her aircraft. Several impacts rang against her fuselage like deadly hail, and warning lights began illuminating her instrument panel. Sarah's F-16 shuddered as enemy rounds found their mark, but the aircraft continued to respond to her controls. She had trained extensively for this exact scenario, fighting with a damaged aircraft against a determined opponent. The key was to remain calm and use whatever advantages remained to her. Her own 20mm cannon was her only remaining weapon, but getting into position to use it effectively would require outmaneuvering an opponent who currently held every advantage. The enemy pilot was skilled, experienced, and flying an undamaged aircraft. Sarah was wounded, running low on fuel, and down to guns only. But she also had something her opponent couldn't match, an intimate knowledge of her aircraft's capabilities gained through years of combat experience. Sarah knew exactly how much punishment her F-16 could absorb and still remain flyable. She knew which maneuvers would work with damaged control surfaces and which would result in a catastrophic loss of control. Most importantly, she could see friendly reinforcements on her radar display, now less than 90 seconds away. All she had to do was survive long enough for help to arrive. The enemy pilot pressed his attack, clearly hoping to finish the engagement before reinforcements could intervene. He dove toward Sarah's damaged aircraft, cannon blazing, trying to achieve the decisive hit that would end the fight. But Sarah had one final trick remaining. She allowed her aircraft to appear more damaged than it actually was, flying with slightly uneven control inputs that suggested serious system failures. The enemy pilot, encouraged by what appeared to be a helpless opponent, moved closer to ensure his next burst would be fatal. It was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. As the enemy fighter closed to point-blank range, she suddenly pulled her aircraft into a maneuver that should have been impossible with damaged control surfaces. The F-16 snapped around in a tight turn that brought her nose to bear on the surprised enemy pilot. Her cannon fired in short, precise bursts, each one walking closer to the enemy aircraft. The other pilot tried desperately to evade, but he was too close and moving too fast to avoid Sarah's fire. Her rounds stitched across his fighter's wing and engine section, causing immediate system failures and forcing him to break off his attack. But instead of trying to escape, the enemy pilot made one final desperate attempt to ram Sarah's aircraft. His damaged fighter, streaming fuel and trailing smoke, accelerated directly toward her position in what could only be described as a suicide attack. Sarah had seconds to react as the enemy aircraft bore down on her position, its pilot apparently willing to sacrifice his own life to prevent her from claiming victory in this incredible aerial battle that had already lasted far longer than anyone had thought possible. The final gambit. The damaged enemy fighter hurtled toward Sarah's position like a guided missile, its pilot committed to a collision course that would destroy both aircraft. Sarah had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. Her damaged F-16 responded sluggishly to control inputs, making evasive maneuvers far more challenging than under normal circumstances. Time seemed to slow as Sarah's training took over completely. She could see the enemy pilot's face through his canopy, could observe the determination in his eyes as he held his aircraft steady on a collision vector. There was no fear there, only the grim resolve of a warrior making his final sacrifice to complete his mission. Sarah pulled her control stick hard to the right while simultaneously applying full rudder, sending her F-16 into a side slip that would have been impossible to execute cleanly with fully functional control surfaces. The maneuver was desperate and dangerous, but it was her only option for avoiding the incoming aircraft. Her fighter slid sideways through the air, its damaged flight controls causing unstable oscillations that threatened to send her into an unrecoverable spin. The enemy aircraft flashed past her position, missing her by less than 10 feet. She could feel the shock wave from his passage, could smell the jet fuel vapors from his damaged fuel system. But the enemy pilot's gambit wasn't over. As his aircraft passed beneath hers, he pulled back hard on his controls, trying to bring his nose up for a second ramming attempt. His damaged fighter responded reluctantly, climbing in an unsteady spiral that brought him back toward Sarah's position. Sarah realized she had one advantage the enemy pilot didn't know about. Friendly reinforcements were now less than 30 seconds away. She could see them clearly on her radar display. 4 F-16s approaching at maximum speed with weapons armed and ready for engagement. If she could just survive the next few moments, help would arrive. The enemy pilot must have seen the same radar contacts because his attacks became even more desperate. He no longer seemed interested in using his guns effectively. Instead, he was simply trying to get close enough to ram her aircraft. It was the tactic of a pilot who knew his situation was hopeless but was determined to take his opponent down with him. Sarah began a series of evasive maneuvers designed to buy time rather than seek an offensive advantage. Her damaged aircraft protested every violent direction change, but she coaxed maximum performance from systems that should have failed minutes ago. Warning lights covered her instrument panel like Christmas decorations, and several critical systems were operating far outside their normal parameters. The radio crackled with incoming transmissions as the reinforcement flight established contact. Phoenix 1, this is Eagle Flight. We have visual on your position and are moving to assist. Break away from the engagement. We'll take it from here. But breaking away wasn't an option with an enemy fighter actively trying to ram her aircraft. Sarah keyed her microphone while pulling her F-16 through another punishing turn sequence. Eagle Flight negative on breaking away. Enemy fighters attempting ramming attack. I'm trapped in close combat and unable to disengage safely. The lead pilot of Eagle Flight acknowledged her transmission with professional calm, but Sarah could hear the concern in his voice. Copy that, Phoenix 1. Maintain your current heading. We're moving to intercept from your 6 o'clock position. The enemy pilot seemed to realize his time was running out. His damaged aircraft was losing altitude steadily, streaming fuel and hydraulic fluid that created a visible trail in the sky behind him. But instead of trying to escape, he made one final attack run that would either succeed or destroy his aircraft in the attempt. Sarah watched him approach through her mirrors, noting the way his fighter wallowed through the air with obviously degraded flight controls. He was committed to this attack regardless of the consequences, and she found herself respecting his courage even as she prepared to defend against his assault. The enemy fighter climbed toward her position in a shallow intercept angle, its pilot clearly planning to match her altitude and speed before initiating the ramming maneuver. Sarah allowed him to close the distance, waiting for exactly the right moment to execute her own final gambit. At the last possible second, Sarah cut her throttles and deployed her speed brakes, causing her aircraft to decelerate rapidly. The enemy pilot, caught completely off guard by this unexpected maneuver, overshot her position and found himself directly in front of her aircraft with no ability to maneuver effectively. Sarah's 20mm cannon spoke one final time, sending a concentrated burst of rounds into the enemy fighter's engine section. The damaged aircraft, already operating on the edge of failure, couldn't absorb this additional punishment. Its engine exploded in a ball of orange flame, sending debris spinning across the sky. But the enemy pilot's courage hadn't been wasted. Even as his aircraft disintegrated around him, he managed to eject safely from the doomed fighter. Sarah watched his parachute deploy and begin its slow descent toward the ground below, carrying a brave warrior who had fought with honor, despite being on the wrong side of this conflict. The 4 aircraft of Eagle Flight swept past Sarah's position, their pilots scanning the sky for any remaining threats. Finding none, they formed up in a protective formation around her damaged F-16, providing escort as she began her journey back to base. Phoenix 1, this is Eagle Lead. Outstanding work up there. We count 6 enemy aircraft down with 0 friendly losses. How's your aircraft status? Sarah performed a quick assessment of her fighter's condition, noting the numerous warning lights and the irregular sound of her engine. Several control surfaces were damaged. Her fuel was running critically low and at least 2 major systems had failed completely, but the aircraft was still flying and she was still alive. Eagle Lead, Phoenix 1. I have multiple system failures and battle damage, but the aircraft is still controllable. Requesting priority landing clearance and emergency services standing by. As the formation of friendly fighters headed toward home base, Sarah allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. In the space of 20 minutes, she had engaged 6 enemy fighters single-handedly and emerged victorious. It was the kind of combat performance that would be studied in military academies for decades to come. But more importantly, she had succeeded in preventing enemy aircraft from reaching their targets. Whatever damage they had intended to inflict on friendly forces or civilian populations had been stopped by her intervention. The mission had been accomplished, despite odds that should have made success impossible. Emergency landing. The flight back to base became increasingly challenging as Sarah's damaged F-16 developed new problems with each passing mile. What had started as manageable battle damage was now escalating into multiple system failures that threatened to make her aircraft unflyable. The engine temperature was climbing steadily, indicating possible internal damage from the near-miss explosions she had endured during the engagement. Her fuel situation was becoming critical as well. The sustained high-power maneuvering of the aerial battle had consumed fuel at a tremendous rate, and she could see warning indicators suggesting that at least one fuel tank had been punctured by enemy fire. Droplets of aviation fuel were streaming from her aircraft's wing, creating a visible trail that concerned the escort pilots flying alongside her. Phoenix 1, Eagle Lead. We're observing fuel leakage from your starboard wing. What's your estimated time remaining before fuel exhaustion? The concern in the other pilot's voice was evident despite his professional tone. Sarah checked her fuel gauges and performed quick mental calculations based on her current consumption rate and distance to base. The numbers weren't encouraging. Eagle Lead, I estimate 8 to 10 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption. Base is still 12 minutes away at safe cruising speed. The mathematics of the situation were unforgiving. She couldn't reach base at her current speed without running out of fuel, but increasing power to fly faster would consume her remaining fuel even more rapidly. It was a classic aviation catch-22 that had claimed many pilots over the years. Phoenix 1. Recommend you declare emergency and request immediate clearance for straight-in approach to the nearest available runway, Eagle Lead advised. We'll contact base operations and have emergency services standing by. Sarah was already reaching for her radio to make the emergency declaration when her engine began running roughly, causing vibrations that shook the entire aircraft. Oil pressure was dropping rapidly, and exhaust gas temperatures were climbing toward the red line. The engine that had carried her through the most challenging aerial combat of her career was finally beginning to fail. Mayday. 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 This is Phoenix 1 declaring emergency. I have multiple system failures, fuel emergency, and engine problems. Requesting immediate clearance to the nearest suitable runway. Her voice remained calm and professional despite the deteriorating situation. The response came back immediately from air traffic control. Phoenix 1, emergency declared and acknowledged. You are cleared direct to runway 09 at Falcon Base. All other traffic is being diverted. Emergency services are responding and will be in position before your arrival. Falcon Base was a smaller military installation than her home field, but it had a long runway and full emergency services. More importantly, it was only 6 minutes away at maximum sustainable power. Sarah advanced her throttles carefully, nursing every bit of performance from her failing engine while monitoring the climbing temperatures that indicated imminent failure. The escort aircraft spread out to give her maneuvering room while maintaining visual contact. Sarah could see the pilots and the other fighters watching her aircraft intently, ready to relay information about any new problems that might develop. Their presence was reassuring, but she knew that ultimately she was alone in the cockpit of a dying aircraft. 3 minutes from Falcon Base, her engine temperatures reached critical levels. Warning tones filled the cockpit as automated systems began shutting down non-essential equipment to prevent catastrophic failure. Sarah felt the engine power fluctuating as internal components began to fail under the stress of sustained high-power operation and battle damage. Phoenix 1, we have the runway in sight, Eagle Lead reported. Emergency vehicles are in position, and you're cleared for immediate landing on any runway. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. Sarah could see Falcon Base ahead, its runways clearly marked and emergency vehicles positioned along the approach path. Fire trucks, ambulances, and crash recovery equipment were all standing by, their crews ready to respond to whatever might happen during her landing attempt. But as she began her approach to the runway, a new problem developed. Her hydraulic systems, already damaged by enemy fire, began failing completely. The flight controls became increasingly heavy and unresponsive, requiring significant physical strength to maintain control of the aircraft. "I'm losing hydraulic pressure," Sarah reported. Her voice strained from the effort of controlling her fighter. "Flight controls are becoming very heavy. I may need assistance with the landing." The tower controller's response was immediate and reassuring. "Phoenix 1, you are cleared to land on any surface at Falcon Base. Runway, taxiway, grass, whatever works best for your aircraft. Emergency crews are ready to assist with any type of landing." Sarah lined up with the main runway, but her aircraft was barely responding to control inputs. The F-16 was flying more like a freight train than a fighter aircraft, requiring constant pressure on the controls to maintain even basic flight parameters. Her arms ached from the sustained effort, and sweat dripped from her face despite the cockpit's cooling systems. 2 miles from touchdown, her engine finally gave up completely. The failure was sudden and dramatic. Temperatures spiked beyond the red line, followed immediately by a complete loss of power. The aircraft's nose dropped as thrust disappeared, and Sarah found herself flying a very expensive glider toward the runway. "Phoenix 1 has flame out," she reported with remarkable calm. "Dead stick approach to runway 09. I will need emergency services immediately upon touchdown." Without engine power, Sarah had only one chance to get the landing right. There would be no go-around, no second attempt. She had to judge the approach angle perfectly, manage her energy precisely, and hope that her damaged flight controls would respond well enough to achieve a survivable landing. The runway grew larger in her windscreen as she descended on final approach. Emergency vehicles paced her along the runway edges, ready to respond the moment her aircraft touched down. She could see firefighters and medical personnel preparing their equipment, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether this incredible combat mission ended in triumph or tragedy. Her airspeed was higher than normal due to the heavy flight controls, but she had no choice but to accept the faster approach speed. The F-16's landing gear extended normally, one of the few systems still functioning properly. Sarah prepared for what would either be a successful emergency landing or the most challenging ejection of her career. The captain's reply: the F-16 touched down hard on Falcon Base's main runway, its tires smoking from the impact and higher than normal approach speed. Sarah felt the aircraft bounce once before settling onto the concrete, but her damaged flight controls made it nearly impossible to keep the fighter tracking straight down the center line. The aircraft veered slightly to the right before she managed to correct with heavy pressure on the rudder pedals. Emergency vehicles raced alongside her aircraft as it rolled down the runway, their crews ready to respond to any sign of fire or further mechanical failure. Sarah deployed her drag chute and applied maximum braking, bringing the damaged F-16 to a stop with barely 200 feet of runway remaining. As soon as the aircraft came to a complete halt, firefighters surrounded it with foam and water, suppressing any potential fire hazards while medical personnel approached to assess Sarah's condition. She completed her shutdown checklist with practiced efficiency, securing all systems before opening the canopy and breathing fresh air for the first time in over an hour. The climb down from the cockpit revealed the full extent of battle damage to her aircraft. Holes from enemy cannon fire dotted the fuselage. Hydraulic fluid stained the concrete beneath the fighter, and scorch marks from near-miss explosions blackened sections of the wing surfaces. It was remarkable that the F-16 had continued flying at all, much less remained controllable enough for a successful landing. "Captain Mitchell, are you injured?" asked the senior medical officer who met her at the base of the aircraft ladder. Sarah performed a quick self-assessment and realized that aside from fatigue and muscle strain from controlling the damaged fighter, she had emerged from the engagement unharmed. "No injuries. Doc, just tired from wrestling with a fighter that didn't want to cooperate." She accepted a bottle of water gratefully, only now realizing how dehydrated the intense combat had made her. Within minutes of her landing, word of the engagement began spreading throughout the military chain of command. 6 enemy fighters destroyed by a single pilot was unprecedented in modern air combat, and senior officers were already requesting detailed debriefings to understand exactly how such a one-sided victory had been achieved. The base commander at Falcon Base, Colonel Roberts, approached Sarah personally to offer congratulations. "Captain Mitchell, what you accomplished up there today is going to be studied in tactical manuals for decades. 6 confirmed kills against modern fighters flying solo is simply extraordinary." But Sarah's mind was already returning to her home base, and the ground forces who had been protected by her intervention. "Sir, the important thing is that we prevented enemy aircraft from reaching their targets. Whatever they were planning to attack, they didn't succeed." 3 hours later, after medical evaluation and preliminary debriefings, Sarah found herself back at her home base facing a room full of senior officers who wanted to understand every detail of the aerial engagement. The debriefing session lasted for nearly 4 hours as she walked through each phase of the combat. From initial contact through the emergency landing, maps covered the wall showing the flight paths of all aircraft involved, and Sarah used a laser pointer to trace her maneuvers while explaining the tactical decisions that had led to her success. The assembled officers listened with fascination as she described techniques that seemed to defy conventional wisdom about air-to-air combat. The key was never allowing them to coordinate their attacks, Sarah explained. "I kept moving, kept them reacting to my maneuvers instead of implementing their own plans. Once I could engage them individually rather than as a formation, my training and experience gave me the advantage." As the formal debriefing concluded, Sarah was approached by General Harrison, the base commander who had authorized her initial patrol mission. His expression was serious as he led her to a quieter corner of the briefing room. "Captain, I've just received word from Division Headquarters. Ground reconnaissance has confirmed that the enemy force you engaged was the advance element of a much larger attack. Intelligence estimates they were planning to strike our forward positions with over 50 aircraft. Your actions this morning disrupted their entire timeline.